Dream Team? It's your boy Neal back with another reaction video, guys. Here we are with why Norway is becoming the world's richest country. Before we dive into this, make sure you guys subscribe, ring notification bell, get a video a thumbs up so it gets suggested. Let's find out. But we are going to break this up into 3 different parts, and I'm intrigued to see why Norway's so rich out there.
In terms of people, Norway is a pretty small country, home to only about 5.5 million individuals.
That is
to
small.
put that into perspective, Norway has fewer people than many of the world's city-states do, such as Singapore's 6 million people or Hong Kong's nearly 7.5 million people. But while small in people, Norway is very large in land. The country has about 385,000 square kilometers worth of overall land, roughly 140 times larger in geographic area than Hong Kong, and roughly 464 times larger than Singapore, despite having a fewer number of people than in either. Put another way,
So it's plenty land for everybody that live there, you feel me?
Norway's geographic size is also roughly equivalent to Japan's, and both countries have a similar amount of mountains that cover them. And yet, Japan has 22 times more people living within its similar mountainous area than Norway. Naturally, this makes Norway one of the most sparsely populated and overall empty countries in the world, with the lowest density of people that can be found anywhere in mainland continental Europe, with the northern half of the country stretching beyond the Arctic Circle in the far north with a very thin layer of topsoil above bedrock. The land of Norway is mostly harsh, mountainous, rugged, and very cold with a short growing season, an environment that doesn't lend itself very well to sustaining large numbers of people. Only 2.2% of Norway's land is even considered arable and suitable for agriculture, one of the lowest percentages in the world and roughly equivalent to Yemen's percentage, a mountainous country in the Arabian desert without even any rivers that's widely regarded as a failed state. This ultimately means that despite having 385,000 square kilometers of overall land, only about 7,124 square kilometers of Norway's land is suitable for agriculture, a paltry amount that is similar to the amount of arable land.
My God. So out of 385,000 square kilometers, you can only use about 7,100 for farming. Could actually grow something if you farm there. So what is the rest of the land good for?
Found in El Salvador, a country that is 16 times smaller than Norway in
That's
overall
crazy.
land, but which has a similar population of about 6.3 million people, because the two countries have a similar amount of arable land that they can actually use to sustain their populations with. And then, to make matters even worse for Norway, their small amounts of arable land are scattered all throughout the south of the country in small valleys in between all of their massive mountains, which has always made the creation of large, integrated, and efficient farms in the country impossible. With its vast and wide open expanses of arable land all throughout the country, the average farm size in the United States is more than 8 times greater than that in Norway as a result. And so, American farms are more integrated, more efficient, and more productive as a result, and can simply feed many times more people. Because of these inherent disadvantages when it comes to agricultural potential, there have been expectations and assumptions made by people all throughout Norway's history that the country should naturally be poor. Or at least, that Norway was historically a poor country until the sudden discovery of oil changed everything in the late 1960s, and paved the way for Norway's currently well-known prosperity.
So it was oil that paved the way, you feel me? Because I'm sitting here, all the information that I done took in so far, I'm sitting here wondering how they so rich? Because it seems like it's all been bad. The land don't sound good, you feel me? You can't really do too much on the land as far as growing crops, as far as farming, as far as any of that. So I'm like, how they get so rich? What they doing? So oil was the key. Okay.
But the interesting truth is that oil didn't actually make Norway rich.
Really?
It just made Norway even richer than it already was beforehand. Contrary to popular belief, Norway has been a relatively wealthy country for most of its entire history. And it almost counterintuitively has to do exactly with the same geography that makes the country so terrible for agricultural production. There are other geographic factors that can determine the fate of nations beyond agricultural potential. And one of the biggest others is how easy it is to travel around the country's territory and conduct trade. Transportation across Norway by land, however, has always been very difficult. For thousands of years before modern highways and tunnels, traveling along the Norwegian west coast on foot or horse was basically impossible because of the omnipresent steep mountains and deep fjords that carved all across the landscape.
All I've been hearing is bad. So oil wasn't the key to gaining wealth. Y'all was already wealthy. Oil just made you a little bit more wealthy. But now the trade, you can't trade over the land because it's too steep and all this. Well, where did the wealth come from? I guess it is a 45-minute video, so if they told us right away, then be a lot of time explaining something else. So I guess we'll see how long it takes for us to pinpoint exactly what the wealth came from.
But this seemingly geographic curse actually turned into one of Norway's greatest geographic blessings in disguise. Because of all the jagged fjords located all throughout the Norwegian coast, Norway is generally regarded as having by far the longest coastline anywhere in Europe, with a coastline that's more than 6.5 times longer than the United Kingdom according to the CIA World Factbook. In fact, Norway's coastline is considered to be so enormous because of all these fjords that it's ranked as having the second longest coastline of all the countries in the entire world, remaining only behind the #1 spot of Canada. This has always meant that as Norway coalesced into a modern nation-state, its small population was always scattered in small clusters all throughout the mountains and the fjords separated from one another across land. Not too unlike other mountainous societies like Afghanistan or Persia. But unlike those societies deep within the interior of Eurasia, the small scattered population clusters across Norway all had easy and immediate access to the global ocean because of all of the fjords that cut deep into Norway's interior. This geography encouraged a maritime culture to develop within Norway from very early on, and the fjords granted the Norwegians the ability to rapidly travel between each other's settlements by sea. Moreover, the fjords enabled easy access for traders to penetrate deep into the country's interior and get close to one of Norway's greatest natural assets, its huge forests and lumber resources. Norway has never had the largest forests in Europe. It's beaten out by many other countries with larger ones like Russia, Finland, Sweden, and even France. But for centuries, all throughout the age of sail before the development of railroads unlocked Russia's lumber potential, Norway's lumber industry was the biggest in Europe because of how much more relatively easier it was to access their forests in the interior, through the fjords, and export it to markets. Norway's lumber could be felled within the interior, then cheaply and efficiently dumped into rivers and floated downstream toward the settlements and sawmills along the fjords, where sawmills powered by those same downhill rivers and their waterfalls would refine the lumber, and the lumber could then be cheaply exported out through the fjords and onto the global market. And so, until the later 19th century, when railroads fully unlocked the lumber potential of European countries with larger forests like Russia, Finland, and Sweden, these relative geographic advantages made Norway the lumber powerhouse of Europe for centuries. And the country's maritime culture enabled it to build out a world-class merchant fleet. By the time that the 20th century rolled around, Norway already had the 4th largest merchant marine fleet in the entire world. The nature of Norway's well-connected but spread out and low-density population also encouraged two things. One, the communities were all connected to each other by the fjords and by the sea, which led to a common identity emerging between all of them despite their mountainous geography. And two, Norway's small population clusters learned early on to cooperate together on shipbuilding and construction for all of their common benefit. Entire Norwegian towns would cooperate together on the construction of ships that were vital for all of their survival, and shares in the ship's ownership would be divided amongst nearly everyone in the town who participated, from the lumberjacks to the craftsmen. Over time, this resulted in a much more spread out and decentralized distribution of wealth and ownership in Norway, in addition to the spread out and decentralized population. And so, a large, centralized, and powerful class of capitalists never really developed in the country the same way that they did elsewhere in places like France and Britain, with their population.
So it sounds like, know what I'm saying? I'll accord it because all of this jagged mountains and steepness and everything, you got the population scattered in like clusters of people, but these clusters of people learn how to work together to create these incredible ships in maritime because they have one of the longest coasts. And then you got the lumber industry where they were able to, before railroads and everything came, it was easy to get to the forest in Norway, easy to chop down the lumber that you needed. They created an easy process of getting it onto the boats, exporting it. And I mean, it sounded like that was the reason that they became wealthy. And they learned, hey, if we all work together, everybody eats. Teamwork make the dream work. Let's all work together. Let's all get rich together. Let's do this. And so by the time everybody else had caught up with them as far as the lumber industry and getting the railroads made, Norway was already ahead of people. They was already way ahead of people. The 4th largest, what would he say, maritime something that was already built. Okay, so Norway was just ahead of its time.
Populations and economies both largely concentrated around their political capitals. Norway's geography, conversely, forced its people to trust each other and to cooperate on building the ships that were vital to their survival. And early shipbuilding in Norway was largely cooperative in nature. And then that influenced the country's economy for centuries afterwards through to the present day, as Norwegian agriculture, forestry, maritime insurance, and fishing all became dominated by cooperatives, while the Norwegian banking sector throughout the 19th and 20th centuries became effectively dominated by cooperative credit unions as well. Across the 19th century then, when Norway was widely believed to be a fairly poor region, Norway was actually already doing very well for itself in relative terms. By the 1850s, Norway's GDP per capita was already higher than basically the entirety of Eastern Europe, exceeding that of Bulgaria, Romania, Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. And by the 1880s, Norway's GDP per capita had eclipsed virtually all of southern Europe too, including Portugal, Spain, and Greece, while by the turn of the 20th century in 1900, it had even surpassed that of Italy. And then by 1938, on the eve of the Second World War, decades before the discovery of oil in the country, Norway's GDP per capita had already exceeded those of Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, and by some estimates, it was already the wealthiest country on average in Europe. A huge part of the reason why Norway's economy accelerated so rapidly between 1900 and 1938 was the advent of modern advanced water turbines and hydroelectric dams that completely revolutionized Norway's geographic potential even further. Norway is a land that is almost completely covered by rivers that begin high up in the mountains and then thunder down their steep elevations toward the fjords and the coast in the west. These rivers are fed by predominantly westerly winds that bring them abundant levels of precipitation, and their steep drops and waterfalls provide a massive amount of kinetic energy just sitting there that can be captured by turbines to generate electricity. Norway, therefore, has one of the highest hydroelectric power potentials of any country in the world. And beginning in 1905, they started allowing outside foreign companies with higher levels of expertise come in and start building modern hydroelectric dams to unlock their potential. Dozens and then hundreds of hydropower stations were built all across the country, to the point where today, there are 84 large hydropower stations with capacities greater than 10 megawatts, and 838 small hydropower stations with capacities between 1 and 10 megawatts, with hundreds of even smaller stations on top of that. All combined, these hydropower stations today are powerful enough to generate an overwhelming 95% of all of Norway's total electricity demand, while Norway is the 7th largest producer of hydropower anywhere in the world as of 2024, with a total generation rate that is more than half of the United States, but all for only 1/67th of the American population. The harnessing of Norway's hydro might in the early 20th century provided the country with its first major economic boom, as it enabled the country to rapidly industrialize and electrify itself. By 1920, Norway was consuming more electricity per capita than any other country in the world, and more than 2/3 of the population already had access to electricity, which was double the rate in the United States at the time. This huge amount of energy for such a small population then enabled.
This is absolutely wild, dog. So Norway, basically, there were pros and cons to where they're geographically positioned. There are things they can't do, and there are things that it benefits them very much from being positioned like that. And basically, they just focused on the pros. They took advantage of everything they could of where they're geographically positioned, understood what they couldn't do, understood what would be a struggle. Forget about that. Hey, let's all work together to do what we can to take advantage of all of these amazing things that, because we're geographically positioned here, come to us. Let's take advantage of all that together and let's get rich. You feel me? Hydropower is absolutely incredible. If you ask me about it, I couldn't tell you nothing in detail. In my brain, the furthest it goes as far as this is you getting electricity from these dams, and water is powering everything somehow. That's about as much as I know about it, but I think it's really cool. I think it's really cool just that Norway has taken it. They haven't focused on what they can't do on the land, but what makes them uniquely positioned, and they took advantage of that, and I think that's awesome. And the fact that they had no choice but to trust each other, so they all work together and trust. And I feel like if most countries, like if you get the people to come together towards a common goal, to get the people to come together, make more money, whatever, you're gonna have a great outcome. But a lot of places people are divided, whereas it seems in Norway there's a lot of trust amongst the people.
the Norwegians to develop extremely energy-intensive factories that eventually began specializing in refined aluminum production under the Norsk Hydro Corporation, which is today one of the largest aluminum companies in the world. Norsk Hydro continues to source the vast majority of the energy they use to produce refined aluminum from Norway's hydropower, and the company is 34% publicly owned by the Norwegian state. It has enabled Norway to become by far the largest producer of aluminum in Europe, and the eighth largest producer in the world today, which further makes the country the largest provider of aluminum to the European Union. But, just as hydropower continued unlocking Norway's potential in the early 20th century, the industry came to become dominated by the large foreign companies that came to Norway to invest and build all of the dams out. And so, Norway sought to gradually wrest control over them to secure its own national control over its own resources. Norway's small and spread out population lacked large amounts of capital and technical expertise, however. They needed the large foreign investors to help them build out their hydroelectric and factory potential. And so, a straight-up quick nationalization of the foreign investors' assets would have sent all of that foreign investment and expertise they needed fleeing in the future. To avoid that outcome, but to still secure their own control over their own resources, Norway decided on taking a pragmatic and long approach to the hydro industry that would directly influence their approach to the oil and gas industry decades later. Norway established rules that foreign companies who came to invest in Norwegian hydro would have to follow, that included clauses that hydroelectric power stations and mines they built and funded would have to be turned over to the Norwegian government without compensation after a period of 60 to 80 years of operation. This way, the larger foreign companies would continue to invest in the country since they would see a long enough return on their investment. But the Norwegian state knew that in the long run, they would be the ones to secure the keys to their crown jewels, and as a result, more than 90% of Norway's hydro capacity is publicly owned by the state today. And this is all why Norway was all—
Norway, y'all smart as they come, ain't y'all? Y'all some geniuses, bro. Countries. Y'all need to be looking at Norway. I know a lot of people, you can't do what Norway can do because of how they're positioned. But the things that you can, figure out what you can do, come together as a community. They written these contracts up to make sure, know what I'm saying, after so long, hey, y'all gonna benefit from these things for so long, but after so long, they gonna belong to us. 60, 80 years that they belong to us. So they just played the long game, that's all.
Already a wealthy, heavily industrialized, democratic, and low-corruption state by the time that interest in the country's potential offshore oil and gas fields came around in the late 1950s. But at the time back then, there were very few people who actually believed that there was any oil or gas to be found around the country, particularly on the shallow and submerged part of the European continental shelf stretching beneath the North Sea, a large part of which had, geologically speaking, only been recently submerged a few thousand years ago at the end of the previous ice age. In a letter written by the Geological Survey of Norway in 1958 that has since aged fairly poorly, they concluded that the possibility of any oil or gas resources being discovered on the Norwegian part of this continental shelf should be discounted entirely. But then, very suddenly in 1959, just the year after that letter was written, a very major natural gas discovery was made nearby that sparked significant further interest: the Groningen gas field in the northern Netherlands. It turned out that the Groningen field to date is the 11th largest single natural gas field ever discovered in the world, and the largest one ever discovered within the European continent. It became central to the early emergence of the Netherlands as a major gas-producing country, and it became a cornerstone of the domestic European gas market. And so, naturally, its discovery back in 1959 sparked renewed interest and curiosity that just perhaps there were further gas and potentially even oil discoveries still to be made further beyond beneath the as-yet unexplored North Sea as well. 3 years later, in 1962, the American petroleum major Phillips became the first to submit an application to the Norwegian government to begin exploring for oil and gas resources within their section of the North Sea. The only problem was, at the time, nobody really knew where Norway's section of the North Sea actually was, because the maritime boundaries within the North Sea hadn't been firmly or legally settled yet between all of the nations that surrounded it. But luckily for Norway in 1965, eager to get exploring and drilling themselves, the government of the UK hastily agreed to simply divide the continental shelf beneath the North Sea based on the principle of the median line distance, the geographic line running down the center of the North Sea between the UK's land territory territory and Norway's land territory. Decades later, this hasty calculation would go on to massively benefit the Norwegians, because it took into account all of the thousands of Norway's islands just off of their western coast in determining where the median line ran.
See, in the UK probably thought they was getting a better end of the deal. They probably thought they was getting better end of the deal, but it ended up to work out beautifully for Norway.
Including the island of Utsira, 16 kilometers west from the mainland Norwegian coast, which shifted the median line boundary westwards just ever so much by a few extra kilometers that when the massive Stratfjord oil field was discovered later in the 1970s, right along the median line, only 15% of it would exist within the previously agreed upon UK maritime zone, while 85% of it would be within the Norwegian zone, giving literally billions of dollars in extra oil revenue to the Norwegians over the British as a result. Almost immediately after
I know they was mad about they was upset about that. The UK couldn't stand that. That had to hurt. But we gonna stop it for part 1 right now, y'all. Make sure y'all subscribe, ring notification bell, give the video a thumbs up. It's your boy D Neal, out.